This is Housebound. I'm Chris.
I'm Holly.
I'm Ashlynn.
I'm Greg.
And you're invited. Welcome to Housebound, a podcast we made because we needed company. In it, we talk about things that are on our minds, and today we're talking about our favorite books. So we're all very well read, and I know that we all have some similar interests, but also varying interests. So I think it would be fun for us to take a look at what each other's, maybe not the most favorite, because that's usually hard to define, but what is a very, very well-read book series that you have, or well-enjoyed book series that you have. Just pick one series and then also talk about a single book that's not part of a series. In fact, it would be great if it wasn't a part of a series, because then it defines the book based on its own merits and not as a part of a larger work of art. I just think it would be interesting to talk about that. So let's start with talking about series. Who wants to go first?
I mean, I can go first.
Great.
Yeah, so I have a series that I have enjoyed for many, many a year. It's probably been in the top echelon, but there is a lot of good book series out there, so it is tough to pick and choose.
Yes, for sure.
But this is probably one that has defined, just as a kid or as a teen kind of growing up, I got obsessed with different things, and this is one of those series that I got obsessed with and has kind of carried forward. So I still follow this author. I still enjoy reading his books, keeping up with him. The first book is Black, which is by Ted Dekker. So the series is Black, Red, White, and Green. And it's called The Circle. I think they rebranded it as The Circle Saga. It used to be the Circle Trilogy, but then a fourth book came out. I'll just read the back of it to give you a bit of a blurb as to what it is. So Black is an incredible story of evil and rescue, betrayal and love, pursuit and death, and a terrorist threat unlike anything the human race has ever known. A virulent evil has been unleashed upon the people of the earth, an unstoppable force bent on the destruction of all that is good. Only Thomas Hunter can stop it, and he has been killed twice. Some say the world hangs in the balance of every choice we make. Now the fate of two worlds hangs in the balance of one man's choice. 4 novels, 2 worlds, 1 story. So just as I'm reading that, all of a sudden I realize, oh yeah, that was about a virus, which is interesting. Just I think any stories now or movies that did that just kind of trigger a little bit nowadays with all that's happening in the world. But anyways, it was a super good book series. It kind of is a mesh between thriller and fantasy, which is kind of a fun blend, because what happens is whenever he sleeps in our world, he wakes up in this fantasy world. And so in our world, he's trying to stop this terrorist attack. And in the other world, he's essentially just kind of exploring it and figuring out, more about the mystical side of that world. So, and it's a world where good and evil are very visible. So, anyways, but it's a great series. There's a lot of fun stuff that he does in it. And, the fourth book came out as kind of a bit of a, you could call it, what's that word?
Retcon?
No.
Bonus?
3D in movies is kind of, it's not necessary, but it's...
Gimmick?
Yeah, gimmick. Okay, yeah. So essentially, the fourth book came out, and it was a bit of you could call it a bit of a gimmick, in the sense that he kind of branded it as, this is something where you could either start with Green, the last book, and let it carry you through the series, or you could end with Green, which is how most of his traditional followers would have read it. And so it was kind of branded as a both and, because it was sort of a cyclical story in the end. Spoiler alert. And
hence the title.
Yeah. So there's a bit of that. And there was actually a bit of somewhat of a controversy, because the fans kind of outcried with his ending of Green. And so then he actually released a 4-in-1 edition of the series that were all in one big hardcover book, and that one actually has the ending that he kind of wrote for his more long-term fans, that where it was kind of like, this is a definitive end rather than something that was more cyclical. So
so fans didn't like the fact that it wrapped back in on itself, or did they just think
Correct.
that the way that it wrapped back in on itself was done poorly, and they would rather...
Yeah, like it just wasn't satisfying, I think, for fans.
Gotcha.
In the sense of like, this is like an epic conclusion, you know. It was kind of more like, oh, okay, here we go again, you know, and they could like keep reading or whatever. So yeah.
So was White, the third book, which was used to be the last book,
Yes.
did that book wrap things up then? Or did it also leave things hanging because the trilogy was supposed to be a circle in the first place?
Yeah, I think he wrote White in the sense that it could end and finish the series off fully, but then Green was essentially kind of his idea that I'm pretty sure he had from the beginning to add in, but it was only if the series did well, because he wrote that whole series and released it all within it was all released within the span of a year, I think. So all
Gotcha.
3 novels, so it was very quick publishing. So
I'm only mildly familiar with the series, and that's because when I was a teenager, I was given Green, so that's the 4th book that is the circle, right? And I got about a third into it, and I was so confused that I actually gave up on the story because I was like, I have no idea what's going on. And my stepmom, who gave me the book, was like, apparently it can be the beginning or the end. And I was like, maybe it's the end only because I don't know what's going on at all.
Yep. Yeah, he said that like he did it through like test audiences or whatever, but like at the end of the day, like while I was reading it, I was like, there's so much here that like references the previous books that like if you're not familiar with them, you're gonna at least feel as if you're missing out on something. So yeah. So so that's kind of the main series that has kind of held on, and I'll probably continue to dip into and reread. So yeah.
That's fun. I have 2 series.
Whoa. Was that allowed?
That's cheating.
No, it's not allowed. It's not allowed. Okay, I'll pick one, but they're by the same author, and that's why I think I should be able to have 2. Both series are by Brent Weeks, who definitively is now my favorite author. And the first series is the Night Angel trilogy, and it's excellent and violent and fantastic. And the second series is the Lightbringer series. So the Lightbringer series is about a world in which the crux of magic is color, and it follows the story, the narrative of one specific character, as they usually do, but he's like the all-powerful, and he ends up being brought low, and then there's a ton of interesting theological imagery and allegory, I think is the correct word for that, which is just brilliant. And the pace of those books is so driving that it's hard to put them down, because the Greg can maybe explain this better because he knows more about writing, but the like recap of what just happened is within the next scene. Like the chapters don't have a lull at all ever, and so it's so difficult to put them down. So I just love them. They're great, and the world building is like phenomenal. So that's my series 1. Just 1. Okay.
So the first series that you mentioned was a trilogy. How many books is in the Lightbringer book series?
There was supposed to be 3, and then at the end of the 3rd one, he was like, oops, can't do it. And so then there was 4, and then at the end of the 4th one, he was like, oops, can't do it. So then there was 5.
Oh, that's such an author move.
Yeah. He tried real hard, though. Like you could feel it in the 3rd one that he was like, okay, I gotta get to the end. But you were like, no, he definitely wrote it too long and then cut it, but it's not in such a way that it's like poorly done at all. But you could feel it like he was trying to get there and couldn't. And then in the fourth one, he drug out the fourth one, like added more to that one to make it more, to make it a full book, and then couldn't finish it again. So you could feel it. But his pace is so driving that him dragging it out doesn't even matter at all. So
his poor publisher.
Yeah. Poor editor. They're long books too. I think it would have taken them a lot of time.
Cool. Well, I think both of your favorite series would be fantasy, right?
Yeah, I would say so.
Fantasy thriller for mine. It is a bit of a mesh, so.
My favorite book series is a genre that I wouldn't have expected enjoying, which is rom-com. I do not read very many rom-com books, and there's very few that I have ever really enjoyed. But I was, how I got introduced to this book was I was substitute nannying for a family, but the kids that I was substitute nannying for were asleep, so it was mostly just me sitting in the living room working on schoolwork while I just waited for one of the kids to wake up, essentially. And they had on their coffee table the book The Rosie Project by Graham Simpson. And it was clear that they hadn't even started reading it yet, but it has a very aesthetically pleasing cover to it. So I had a feeling that it was like just there for aesthetic purposes, this book. and it was very trendy at the time too. And this family was quite well off. So I picked it up because I wanted a break from my homework, and I just read the first few pages, and I loved the character. So the Rosie Project series stars this man whose name is Don Tillman, and he is a genetics professor. And in the very first few pages, he is asked by a fellow professor to do a lecture available for the public all about Asperger's syndrome. And so he does this for a bunch of parents of children with Asperger's, and then afterwards his coworker comes up to him and was like, did you find anything, did you really connect with what you were talking about? And he was like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. And that's kind of the hint to the reader that Don Tillman may or may not have Asperger's. And as you read, you can kind of get inside his mind and the way he thinks, and it's really, really funny and hilarious and interesting, and his thoughts are always like quite logical, but in a direction that you wouldn't necessarily normally go, and it was just a lot of fun. So the first book, The Rosie Project, is Don Tillman researching and finding out that men who are married live longer and happier lives, so therefore the only logical choice is to get married. So he builds a questionnaire that he starts giving to women that he made himself as to what would be his perfect wife. And so
that's so good.
It's so cheesy, but it's written so deliciously, and the inside of Don Tillman's head is just a fun place to be. And then in the second book, The Rosie Effect, he's with this woman, and the second book is quite frankly not very good, but the ending of the first book has a bit of a social commentary that I had some qualms with, and I didn't really agree with a whole lot of his conclusions, and I think he realized that, and the second book fixes that. So the second book kind of just fixes the errors that were in the first book, but doesn't really add tons to the story. And then the third book is The Rosie Result. So him and his wife now have a child, and they're raising him. And the third book is like the ultimate pinnacle. It's so good. The ending is so satisfying, and I cried. It was just wonderful.
Oh boy.
It's a joy. It's a happy read. Like, you're smiling while you're reading it.
I was also given this book by my stepmom, and because I have zero interest in rom-coms, I have never read it, but perhaps I will have to give it a try after such a glowing review.
Even I read it, and I definitely do not read rom-coms, but I enjoyed it. It was good.
Yeah, well, it sounds more interesting than, like, just a romance novel, which doesn't interest me at all.
Yeah. You can totally just read the first book as is and have it just ended after there. But if you did have problems with the ending, read the second book because it'll fix them. And then by the time you've committed to 2, you might as well read the third because it's wonderful.
That's fair.
I do realize that my interests in movies flows over into my interests for books because both are stories, which flows into my interests for TV, yada, yada, yada. And obviously that's going to be the case. So it should come as no surprise when my favorite book series or many series that I enjoy happen to be fantasy or sci-fi. So the book series specifically that I have chosen to talk about is it's a young adult story. The first book was published in 2002, but it was probably like 2004, 2005, right when I was around grade 8, grade 9, before I actually got into the series and picked up on it, or discovered it and got into it. And the series is called Pendragon. The author's name is DJ McHale. He writes many young adult to like early teen and late youth aged. So like anywhere from like, I would say age 8, 9, 10 to like 15 or 16, kind of that age range. And that might even be stretching it a bit. But I really enjoyed the book series during that age range, and so I felt like, yeah, he hit the nail on the head with piquing my interest. And the series itself has 10 books, so if you do the math, that's 10 books in 7 years, plus between the 9th and the 10th book, we all knew that the 9th book was the pentultimate, so we were waiting and waiting and waiting, those of us that were reading it. And I say those of us not because I was actually engaged in an online community related to it at that point, but because I got one of my friends from high school hooked on the series, and I gave him the first or second book as a birthday present for his birthday when we were in grade 8. So grade 8 must have been definitely when I first started reading it, now that I think about it. And between the 9th and the 10th book, the author released 3 kind of prequel books that were each in total they probably equated about the length of one of the smaller books in the series. They weren't an incredibly lengthy book. They were each something like 230 pages, and they basically went and told the stories of a different character from each of the first 8 books, including the main character. And so as a result, that makes 9 stories. And the premise behind it is that this kid, Bobby Pendragon, he's like a 14, 15-year-old. He has a love interest. He's in high school, or just into high school. And if I remember correctly, I think he was possibly involved with football, possibly basketball. He wasn't like a super popular kid, but he was well enough liked. And he had an uncle who was a little bit quirky, but one day his uncle comes to him and goes, "All right, let's go." And Bobby's like, "What? Like, where are we going?" "Oh, we're going to travel through this thing called a flume, which is basically a magical door that exists in a very specific location on Earth, which happens to be pretty close to where we live. And you are what's called a traveler, and you're somebody that can travel between these different realms, and the entirety of these realms exist in a universe or an existence that encompasses several different it's hard to explain. They're like locations. So it's not like you're traveling from planet to planet. You're using these magical doorways to travel to a different... It's like, if you think of it kind of like Stargate, but instead of planets, it's just different like planes or something like that. It's more sci-fi than it is a discussion on religious ideals about how realities exist, if you know what I mean. It's simply there as a magic treehouse can travel through time, and so why can't these guys travel to different locations in this bigger reality? And along the way, he has to, of course, fight a villain, and the villain can also travel, and so that makes it difficult, because when the villain travels to another location, he has to kind of find the door or the flume that let the villain escape, and he has to use the same one to travel because each location only has one. So that becomes a larger part about midway through the books, and there's a couple of really fantastic twists in the series, and I waited way too long to start collecting the books, and so being the collector that I am, I didn't get all of the original print covers that I was hoping to get once I finally got around to it. But I had already shot myself in the foot, because when the 10th book came out, I didn't want to wait for the paperback, so I just bought the hardcover. So it's all paperbacks and then hardcover, which aesthetically makes me twitch, but it's nice to have all of the books. So, and then the little trilogy of books that exists between the 9th and the 10th book, like I said, it tackles one character from each of the books, because he meets a different main character or another traveler from each location in each of the books, and so he kind of teams up with them to help stop the bad guy. So these are little, like, well, in a 230 page book, whatever that divided by 3 is, just, you know, a short amount of chapters that's like a prequel that discusses how his uncle first kind of arrived at these other locations and made contact with the natives to this place, and kind of got onto good terms with the people there. And so then that way, when you jump into the book series, each book isn't half of a book setting up building relationships with people, because his uncle already knows the people there. And so Bobby just kind of follows along and becomes his own caretaker of this reality by the end of the series, kind of deal. And so it's really interesting, because it's written mostly through a bunch of journal entries, which when I tried to get Holly to read the book, she was dissuaded by, because a journal entry means he's written about it, which means anything that's
he's fine.
climactic has already passed, because he's already written about it. But
yeah, I was like, obviously he won this.
that didn't faze me too much when I was reading it as a teen. I thoroughly enjoyed the writing in the series. I don't think that there was any book that was dull. I think each book really did a very good job of building on top of the one that came before. But I did feel that there was one book where it takes place on Earth, and I kind of felt like that one was a little bit boring, because there wasn't something fantastical. There were still fantastical things, but in my mind I was like, Earth is meh. I want to see other places. So that was the only qualm that I had about the series. Otherwise, I loved it and highly recommend it for any teens that are into sci-fi fantasy, but don't want to get, bogged down with something like trying to jump into the world of Star Wars that has a million things at every end of the spectrum. So